Hello, everybody, and welcome back. I'm delighted to introduce our keynote speaker for today, and a particular thanks for getting up very early to be with us because he's in a different time zone in the United States. So welcome to Otto Scharmer, who is the senior lecturer at the MIT Sloan School of Management and the co-founder of the Presencing Institute. So this conversation is entitled Learning from the Emerging Future. Now, in your book, Theory U, Learning from the Future as it Emerges, you invite us to see the world in new ways. What we pay attention to and how we pay attention, both individually and collectively, is key to what we end up creating. Now, of course, there's a sector that really knows how to get our attention and keep our attention is the people who do marketing and advertising. But do you think in the area of policy making, we should be more aware of our attention and where that lies?
Well, we definitely should. And so good afternoon, everyone. I would say this week here, I don't know how it was covered in Europe, but this year, this last week here in the United States was Frances Hogan, her testimony on Facebook. And the whole Facebook story is really about illuminating the blind spot, what is actually driving our attention, which is the algorithms. And so that right now, the algorithms have been hidden away from our attention. But in reality, what her testimony does is that it's put that the algorithms, in other words, what it is that's put in front of our attention are more put into the center of our democratic attention, of our democratic conversation. And in that way, of course, it is all about policymaking, because the whole attention economy today, which is that a company like Facebook is $1 trillion company with virtually no oversight, because kind of the CEO is also the owner, right? And there is virtually no oversight, that societies around the world outsource their whole communication process to a single person with no oversight that is building $1 trillion company. Is astonishing in itself, and it's based on an agreement that never happened, and the agreement is that big data and big tech can turn human experience into data and analytics that are then sold for profit to other companies in order to manipulate behavior and attention on the level of the collective, which, as we all know, works beautifully, which is the reason why it's $1 trillion company. But at the source of that $1 trillion company is a contract that never happened. And that's in our blind spot today. And that's probably the most important blind spot we have in policymaking. And interestingly, it was Europe, right? That awareness is not in Silicon Valley. It's not in China. It's not in many other tech-driven places. But it was, interestingly, Europe kind of that has been at the forefront of the policymaking there. But I think what we have seen so far is just the very beginning. And the last round, when kind of Europe made some regulation in this direction, it was replicated in California right away. So I think there is a quick takeoff from some of the other regions. And that's certainly a really important one that this week and in these days is very much in the center of global attention.
Thank you for that. And you mentioned the attention economy, and I know that I spend a lot of time working with advocacy groups and campaigners, and one of the things that supposedly was going to be the part of the democratic aspects of new tech was that in this attention economy, everyone had the same power. You had power as an individual about, the consumer choices you made. You had, because companies and even politicians were going to compete for your attention. It was going to be the great leveler. And I remember when the big tech companies were formed, they were going to be do no evil. They were seen very much as this was going to be a balance for society. It would be open, it would be create transparency, it would be an end to this corporate secrecy. And as you said, this week we've seen it's absolutely the opposite. And Europe has, you're right, attempted to look at how you can create a human-centered digital environment. But even within Europe, we have this dynamic tension between the need for an ethical approach to regulation of data and tech. And the other side is, if we don't win the race against China or the United States, we won't be competitive anymore. So we have this dynamic tension, even in Europe, where there is still an emphasis on ethics and human rights. Can you tell me a little bit about how your book Theory U helps us to address this and deal with some of these dynamic tensions that exist?
Well, there's so many aspects to your question. So I would say yes, you are absolutely right. At the source of, I mean, famously, Google had that one as one of their organizing principles until it dropped out. And I think it is a great question, and kind of a lot of the people working in tech are actually inspired by making the world a better place. But then somehow these efforts got hijacked, right, by an awareness that is just limited to empire building. That's kind of just organized around ecosystem awareness. And I think one of the great books that is describing this development is Shoshana Zuboff's The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And but of course, that is not the only possible trajectory, right? So, there could be, and I would say kind of it's an evolution. The problem is not technology in itself. The problem is the underlying human intention that we use to design, distribute, and deploy technology. That's the problem. And I think if that intention is just based on ecosystem awareness, we just create more of the same. But if it is based on ecosystem awareness, that means kind of on a democratic awareness that is serving the well-being of all, then then technological environments will be designed in a different way and will have an impact that is more evolving with human awareness and human consciousness. So in other words, they will create kind of more like environments that allow us to see ourselves through the eyes of others and to see ourselves through the perspective of the whole. And when I talk about awareness-based systems change and awareness-based leadership, then that is based on my past 20, 25 years of experience as an action researcher. Action research means kind of that you need to participate in change initiatives to really understand them and to surface the knowledge that matters today. And the two main things that I learned, the 2 or 3 main things that I learned in these years is, number one, you cannot change a system unless you transform consciousness. So in other words, you cannot change a system unless you transform the awareness based or the mindset based on which people are operating inside these systems, unless that mindset is shifting from ego to eco. In other words, from a silo view to a systems view. Systems view meaning kind of including the perspectives of others into that. And so that was one learning, right? That, and kind of all of us probably have been in change initiatives where some outer structures are changed, process or, a new boss or kind of Now the unit is divided in even more pieces, or something is being merged, whatever it is. But if that outer structure and outer process doesn't come together with the interior dimension, doesn't come together with a shift of the way we think, we pay attention, and we connect, we converse with each other, then the same people create the same problems, just in a new structure, right? So we have all seen that. So that interior dimension, right, bringing that interior dimension and really shifting mindsets, or shifting human awareness, or shifting consciousness, as I said before, that really is the core of many deep change processes today. So that's the first thing that I learned. The second thing that I learned is on the how, because if that's true, the real question is, how do you actually do that? What is facilitating? So how do you construct a learning environment that allows this ego to eco shift from ecosystem awareness to ecosystem awareness to happen, which of course we know needs to happen in so many places right now. And what I learned there is also something very simple, which is that you cannot change or transform consciousness unless you make a system sense and see itself. So you cannot transform consciousness unless you make a system see and sense itself. So from a traditional systems thinking view, you would have said you cannot transform consciousness unless you make a system see itself. Okay? But that's so that's a step in the right direction, but I don't think that's radical enough, because often when I only see what's broken with the system, say I have a systems map and I know what's broken with you and so on, it's still stuck here in the head, right? It doesn't, and we know that the big problem we have in society is the knowing doing gap. We know everything that should happen, right? Environmentally and all these things, but we are not enacting it collectively, right? We are still kind of reenacting the old pattern. So on a level of the collective, we have a disconnect between the head and the hand. And whenever in a system you have a disconnect between the head and the hand, the leverage point for transforming that broken relationship or this disconnect is the heart, right? Is connecting to the knowing of the heart. And so that's why the second word is so important. Make a system see and sense itself, right? Because if I cannot feel the pain of the other, right, in the system, if I cannot feel the pain of those that we exclude with our various mechanisms of exclusion, then I'm very unlikely to take action in a way that's really transformative. So that's make a system see and sense itself. It means you need to build learning environments that allow us, right, as a that could be on the level of the city, right? Kind of when you think about the donut economy, that can be on the level of a country, or on a level of the EU. It can be on a global level. Making the system see and sense itself, looking into the mirror of the whole and beginning to recognize how I, in my everyday behavior, is contributing to the bigger problems that we face there. So I think that's the role, of course, where technology could play a great role, right? But then, of course, the way technology is created today is a one-way mirror, right? So there's like the tech teams see everything about what's driving our behavior. It's so effective. It's shockingly effective. And then they can manipulate behavior on an economic, but also on a political level, as we know. And that's what's being sold. But what we need is not the one-way mirror. What we need is a real mirror where we as communities can look into the mirror and become aware of, right, the disconnect, say, between head and hand, and then be able to transform that. That's what's necessary, and that's why the democratic the leverage point, I think, for the years and the decades ahead, and the leverage point for the policy making of the future that you talked about, is about realigning attention and intention. Because realigning attention and intention is, I believe, the real superpower of our age. The real superpower is not the US, right? It's not China, right? The real superpower, as we saw in the pandemic, is our capacity to realign attention and intention on the level of the collective, right? That's when we can make mountains move. That's when within weeks we can transform collective behavior. That's when we can move trillions of dollars and align it with our own intention. So there's a lot of these things that we thought are given and are driven by external laws can be actually subject to human intention, both on the level of the individual and on the level of the collective. I think that's what we learned from COVID, and that's what we now need to apply to the big challenges ahead of us.
Thank you, Otto. It's really interesting listening to you, and I was very much struck by, as you say, COVID is a transformation event. It has touched, 90% of the world's workplaces and 90% of the world's education places were disrupted. So it was truly a global threat. And that created this alignment between the intention to find a treatment or a vaccine and the political will and the resources. But I'm already seeing that the parts of the world that have got high levels of vaccination are champing at the bit to go back to normal, to get back into business as normal, to get the economies going. And the large parts of the world, which are already the parts of the world that are suffering from climate change and others that are unvaccinated and not getting access to this. So we had this moment of clarity, of alignment between intention and attention. But I sense that starting to dissipate already. And I'm wondering, because we have a community here of the adult education environment, we talked in the earlier panel about the power of adult education to make connections, bridges of empathy, to bring people to shared values. But it's the least funded sector of the education world. It's got the least resources, and yet we rely on it a lot to give people, citizens, the critical literacy to deal with disinformation, to play an active role in democracy, to challenge the power of institutions or organizations who can literally control their behavior, can manipulate their data, manipulate their emotions. To what extent do you think adult education, is it the inoculator against this power? How strong do you think it could play a role in trying to keep this alignment between intention and attention that was so temporarily visible?
Absolutely. I think adult education, adult learning, lifelong learning, these are the most important and least funded sectors. I think if you look at the whole education and leadership sector, so not only the educational sector, but when you look at kind of all learning functions that we also have in organizations and say leadership development in public and private institutions, then you can think about it really as a matrix, right? So, and on the one axis, you have the evolution of learning. And that's kind of the one big thing that I believe has been going on over the past decade or two, which is old learning environments that are just head-centric, right? Kind of technical knowledge and all of that, purely conceptual knowledge, towards head and hand, that's kind of learning by doing, and then towards an even deeper form of learning, which is transformational learning, head, heart, and hand, right? So blending kind of all three, head, heart, and hand, and really moving beyond simply kind of learning by doing towards that is also including the access of the knowing of our heart, which often is in learning environment related to the use of social arts, right, in learning environment, and the use of awareness and mindfulness practices. So that's one dimension, deepening the learning process from head-centric to head, heart, and hand. And the other dimension, I would say, is, who is the learner, right? Is it just the individual, or is it groups? Is it, circles of people, right? Or is it even whole organizations, or is it even larger systems or ecosystems, right? By which I mean really all the people, all the stakeholders that you need to connect with in order to change how a system is operating, right? That you're dealing with. And those people many of whom tend to be outside of your own organization. So that's kind of the other dimension. And when you think that as a matrix, right, then most of the resources go into one corner, individual learning, head-centric, right? So kind of that's where a lot of a little bit learning by doing and a little bit team learning, but most of that is in that corner. And the blind spot really is transformational learning environments in general, but in particular, transformational learning environments that blend the individual with the collective, right? That blend the individual with the larger systems issues that we face. That's the most underfunded sector. And yet, I would say in Europe, there is a great tradition, right? So I don't know whether you have seen, I think there was an interesting book coming out a few years ago, The Nordic Secret, right? Because if you look at the success stories of Europe, one of them is in Northern Europe, historically, kind of that went from the bottom of the list in terms of development to the very top when you look at outcomes in learning and health and governance and so on and so forth today. And very much at the source of that success story is an educational intervention connected with the originally it was the Danish folk high school, which really was, so today that's really referred to as adult learning and adult development, right? But back then it was kind of whole person, whole systems learning, right? Kind of really creating a different kind of social field that allows the learner to really experience the deeper creative capacities that we all bring as human beings, but that often are not activated in the traditional learning environment, that are just centered around the head. And I think that's really kind of creating these kinds of, I would say, what is that really? It is like a generative social field. So it's kind of an environment that you enter into and that allows you to experience deeper creative capacities that you already have, but that are not activated through the traditional environments we are in. And I think that's what's going to happen. That's what we really need to invest into. And I don't know whether you followed that a little bit, but so one of the interesting developments coming out of COVID is COVID, we first thought that's kind of the great equalizer, but then it was the amplifier of everything that's broken, right, as you said. So one of the interesting things coming out of COVID 2021 this year is what's called kind of the Great Resignation, right? People marching out of their old jobs, where you're underpaid and where none of these deeper creative capacities that I just mentioned are activated. I think that's the main reason. People say, well, why are so many people marching out of their existing job and creating kind of their own enterprise, kind of their own, or kind of starting themselves something new that not only allows them to be more flexible in terms of their work environment, but also to have more control and to have more connection to what they really care about and to activate deeper capacities within themselves. So I think the challenge there for bigger organizations is, how can we create learning environments for people that make us still relevant for the next generation? Because it's particularly the younger people marching out of these old style institutions. And I think that's a really interesting indicator for reminding us for something that we already know, right? the work environment that most of us happen to operate in needs to drastically shift in order to be able to activate these deeper human capacities and aspirations that we all bring, but that in many environments are not really activated.
Thank you, Otto. I would agree that one of the big things about COVID is that it was both a transformation event and the great accelerator of trends that were already coming. We already saw within the commercial sector, the companies redeveloping purpose. Not just shareholder value, but why are we here? And this was driven very much by younger employees who have different value sets. And so you had the evolution of the B Corporation. I think that was starting, but as you say, COVID forced people to say, if life is short, is this where I want to spend the rest of my time? And there was certainly a reconnection with green spaces, the power of families, because suddenly we saw people with their caring responsibilities, their kids, their families, their pets, and it reconnected people in a different way. But we have a question from the audience, and I'm going to bring in Sarah to ask this question. Sarah, would you like to go ahead and share the question from the audience?
Yes, of course. We have this question for Otto. It's a question that allows you maybe to elaborate a bit on what you were telling just now. Are we as individuals and as a society equipped to embrace new patterns, see and sense ourselves, and cope with disruption?
Thank you, Sarah. Tough one, Otto. Are we ready as individuals and society for change?
Well, no and yes, right? So when disruption happens, there's always kind of this feeling that this is overwhelming and that we are not ready. But what we also experience, and I think what we also experience in COVID, is that with disruption also grows the capacity to rise to the occasion. So, for example, in COVID, to really, as we just discussed, right? So to realize that when you look at life and your work life and what you spend attention, what you spend most of your attention and time with, and with whom, right? That these things, when you look at them from and what is it that really matters going forward? So whenever disruption happens, there is this little gift that we can reperceive. What is it that truly matters to us? Kind of what is it that's truly essential for us? And then from that viewpoint, maybe let go of some of the old patterns, kind of that, occupied a lot of our time yesterday, and make more central going forward some other themes or topics or ways of being that now feel to us more essential. So this whole process of, I believe that whenever disruption happens, we have the ability to let go and let come. Let go of some of the patterns that are no longer, maybe they served us in the past, but they are no longer that essential maybe now and going forward. And then let come more of what we now feel more drawn towards. And I think that's really this underlying question of how do we as human beings relate to the future? And I think that makes us really kind of, so we are the one species, right? That has this special relationship to the future. And so sometimes future is confused with what future studies tells us, right? Or what some expert tells us. But mostly that is just extending the past into the future, looking at the trends and then seeing, well, that's what's going to happen tomorrow. When I talk about future, I mean something very different. I mean something that's very personal, right? Because when you talk to the real innovators, right, in science and technology and society, you realize that there is a deeper connection that we can have to our future. And it is more like a future that I believe is accessible to all of us, that has to do with where do I, in my life and work, sense a future possibility that depends on me in order to come into reality, right? So where in my life and work do I sense a possibility of the future that depends on me in order to manifest? And I think that's a question that's very personal, but it's also very powerful, because the more I connect with this field of resonance, and at the end of the day, all transformative learning environments are learning environments of resonance, where we not only project things out, but we begin to sense what nature, or what a social field, or what another person is speaking to us, right? It's not only projecting out, but receiving back, right? Beginning learning to listen to an emerging space of possibility that, when we pay attention to it, we can connect with around us. And I think it's these deeper learning processes, many of which have to do with becoming more literate with resonance, and allowing, opening up to these deeper ways of knowing that we all have, but that in our traditional learning environments are not fostered, and and are not supported in a way that we get methods and tools that allow us to be more literate in accessing these deeper ways of knowing. That's what I would say is deep learning. That's learning processes that would address the most important blind spot today that I believe exists in our learning environments, which is transformation literacy. So what I mean with transformation literacy is the methods and tools that allow us to connect with future possibilities, to activate or to connect with our, not only a sense of what I really, really would like to do, but also to connect with our action confidence, to step into this uncharted territory. Because most people today, let's face it, know that we live in an old system that's hitting the wall, right? Most people want to be part of a new story, but they don't know how. And what's missing is transformation literacy. It's the methods and tools that not only allow us to sense what it is that's actually wanting to happen in our life, but then also to activate the action confidence to step into that uncharted territory. And today, in many institutions, what we see is people sense already something different needs to happen, but there is the voice of doubt, and a voice of cynicism, and a voice of fear that prevents us from taking this step into this uncharted new territory. And that's where action confidence and this deeper transformation literacy, I think, can help us to engage with reality in a way that's more aligned with our intentions and less with reacting against what we don't want to see.
Thank you, Otto. I think it's very interesting the way you set it out, and also highlighting that the extent to which we are paralyzed by fear, and so much of our response at individual or even society level is as a result of fear. And I'm struck by the fact that, every decade for the last 20 or 25 years, there's been a major thing that has come and has unsettled everyone. So in 2001, we had the terrorist attacks, and that led everyone to question their physical safety. That created a sense of insecurity, and there was a fear that drove policy and politics. Then in 2008 in Europe, we had the economic crisis, which lost a whole generation of people and saw their futures go up. And even though by 2019 we had more people in work than we'd ever had in Europe, a lot of it was part-time work, it was precarious work, it was self-made work, it was individuals who were freelance. And then, we've now had the pandemic, which remind us that we can't even take our own health for granted. And we're in the process of seeing the world explode around us with climate change. I think that will be the next big shock when we realize parts of the earth are no longer livable. But each of those are moments that create a huge atmosphere of fear. And Otto, what you're talking about, the need for transformative learning spaces, needs people to be able to move away from that, because even at a physiological level, when we're in the fight or flight reaction, when our bodies and our vision is literally closed down by fear, there's a difference to what we can physically see when our body is flooded with adrenaline from fear. So how do you see that adult learning could create a space that is safe enough for this transformation to happen, so that the adrenaline can drain away and there is a space of possibility for co-creation rather than the away from motivation that's driven by fear?
Well, just, to add one more data point, I'm teaching currently a class here at MIT ULab, so around pretty much the same issues. And then we, in the last, so it's a bigger group of students, kind of both MBA and many mid-career professionals from MIT and Harvard. And then, so after going through all these other questions, right, in the end, so there was 2 questions, right? One was, what's holding you back, right? And the word, so everyone was giving the answers, right? So we did that online, and then kind of the analysis of that, the word cloud arising out from that is one word in the center and everything around. The word in the center is fear. And then, so what would support you to deal with that and to step into that? And there was, interestingly, what was the most interesting thing about all these answers were, there's nothing external, right? All of these things that it takes to deal with that are like, so it's support. So it's stuff we can do when we just organize as a community that we can help each other with, right? It's very organizable, right? When you think about, so in other words, the support is for most of us that, we need an environment where people see us in our capacities, who we really are, right? A capacity of deep listening. We need kind of people who understand that, us, kind of who can support us in some of these steps and struggles and so on. So we need basically a generative social field, I would say, relationships that are really designed for support in situations like that. And that may not be everything. So I think there's obviously also economic drivers and that. But I would say what it was interesting how important fear is as an inhibitor, and then how much we can actually do from a small group and relationship perspective that would mitigate some of these disabling forces or inhibiting forces. So I would say the voice of fear is something, the first step of dealing with the voice of fear, and maybe the most important one is seeing it as voice of fear. Because usually, right, so we are driven by these voices without being aware of that. And that's kind of the one-way mirror, right? It's like kind of Facebook, right? Driving your behavior without you seeing it, right? So, and the moment you see it as what it is, so that's kind of bringing it to your attention. It's bringing it to your awareness. And in that moment, you already begin to develop other options, how to deal with it. Because you realize that's not me, it's it, right? It's kind of, so I'm not my fear. I have a voice of fear. But I am not the voice of fear, right? So I can notice it, and I can maybe pick up some important information from that voice of fear, because the voice of fear is usually driven by some valid concerns, right? And then they can be addressed, and we can move forward together. So I think seeing it as voice of fear and making it part of a conversation that allows it to have a legitimate voice without becoming the only thing, right, that's driving our behavior. I think that's where the leverage point is. And then realizing when you put that voice into the larger conversation, there is a lot we can do with the environments kind of that we already have, and that kind of, if organized in a slightly different way, could support us to move into a different direction.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Otto Scharmer, for spending some time with us today. It's been absolutely inspirational and empowering, because you took us to the point where we can see the fear and we recognize it, but we don't allow it to control us. We allow it to be just one input, and we hear what it has to give us as information, but that just becomes one input that we can align with where we want to go. So I think this gives us a really great point to end our day. We started this morning looking to see how adult learning could foster a more inclusive and sustainable future for Europe. And I think you've taken us to the point to remind us that we have this incredible cognitive capacity to collaborate. And when we align intention and attention, then there's no stopping us. We can outthink a virus, but only if we collaborate together. So thank you very much, Otto. And of course, we'll share links to the audience, to your book and some of the work that you're doing, so people can follow up on this. Thank you all to the audience for participating today. It's been a fantastic, inspiring day. I hope you enjoyed it. Please feel free to share your comments and your questions.